Hello and welcome back to the Daily Objective. Today it's gonna be me again, as yesterday. Usually behind the scenes, but I'm in front of the camera again. And also Michael is joining me. Hey Michael.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm all right. So before we talk about the actual topic, we have a couple of news updates. So first, Biden asked Netanyahu to pause for 3 days and I think the reason to pause basically the military action for 3 days, and apparently it's so Hamas can release more hostages, which at least to me seems a bit weird since to date they only released two hostages. Uh, s- do you have anything to comment on this, Michael?
I think the whole idea of a pause is stupid. I really don't know what else to say about it. It's dumb.
So talking about the stupidity of pause, Israel is going to pause for 4 hours every day. Maybe not every day. It's unclear if they meant it like every day or every other day or something like that. But they are going to pause to basically allow for humanitarian aid, or so people from Gaza from the north can evacuate to the south. Uh, and one more thing is the drone. Uh, there was a drone hit on Eliat, which is a Israeli town on the south, and apparently it was likely fired from Yemen. So from the Houthi, or like in Yemen there's a civil war. I was like researching this last week, so I learned about Yemen a lot now. There is like a civil war, and one part is actually firing rockets all the way from Yemen uh to Israel. It doesn't seem like Israel is gonna do any is going to have any response. So I'm wondering what they are waiting for, if they are waiting for until someone actually dies from these attacks. Anything you'd like to say before we go to the main topic, Michael?
Well, I believe Yemen has waged war on Israel, so it wouldn't be surprising that they were shooting rockets at them. And I mean, the military strategy is not my strong suit by any stretch of the imagination, but it may just be that Israel doesn't want to stretch itself too thin by respond to Yemen, and then maybe they get Syria launches something, or who knows who else, Lebanon, and then you end up fighting on all these different fronts, and they can't cut it. Maybe that's why. Perhaps Yemen's just not that big of a threat. I ultimately don't know.
Uh, well, we might see in the upcoming days. So today we're going to talk about the corruption, let's say. I'm not even sure if you can there is something besides corruption when it comes to Hamas leadership. But there's been this article about top three leaders and how much of a net worth they have. And it turned out they together have about 11 million and are able to enjoy a very luxurious life in Qatar. And I think I have even the specific numbers just to mention them. So there's Hanye, uh, who pre presides over one of the world's wealthiest terrorist groups. He's worth 4 billion. Then there's Abu Marzouk, a senior political leader. He is worth 3 billion. And then there's Mashal, who issued a global threat against Jews after the October 7th atrocities, and he's worth 4 billion, which was really surprising to learn because I also looked up the GDP of all of Palestine, not just Gaza, and it's actually less. It's 10 billion. Although to be fair, I think the one I looked up is like from 2012. I'm not sure how much
Well,
economical growth Palestine had, but
well,
yeah.
Daniel, I think we need to be a little bit precise in our language here. There is no Palestine. There's no country called Palestine. There's people that call themselves Palestinians and they have territories, but there is no Palestine. Nor has there ever been a state called Palestine ever. I like to be clear about that because people always often say Israel and Palestine as if there's
Mhm.
two states. There's
Mm.
just Israel. And of course,
Uh,
Gaza and the West Bank, but those are not countries either.
uh, Fair enough. And then I looked up also specifically if we are talking about Gaza, the GDP is about 2 billion, which is the actual area Hamas controls over. So Michael, what do you think? What were your first thoughts when you read this article, when you heard about this story?
Well, it doesn't say how they got rich. It does say that they get significant funding from Qatar and Iran. I think it said maybe said Turkey as well, but I'm not positive. Or one of them stayed in Turkey. But even the money that they cited coming from those countries wouldn't amount to $11 billion. So I don't really know where they get the money from. Calling them corrupt, I mean, I get what we're getting
Mhm.
at, but you're talking about a barbaric homicidal organization. I mean, they're corrupt by definition almost. You know what I mean? They are what they are. So mostly I just the fact that these leaders get $11 billion, that's like to me the least troubling thing about this organization. Like I really don't, I mean, not that I don't care about it, but they're murdering Jews, they're murdering Israelis. That to me what's important. And to argue, like I'm not really sure what benefit it has to bring this stuff into the discourse, because if somebody out there is not convinced that Hamas is bad based on the fact that they murder people, rape women, and kill children, the fact that their leaders are worth $11 billion, I don't think is going to be the deciding factor to push anybody over to the Israeli side.
Well, I'm thinking if I would like do a devil's advocate, maybe the only like justification for it, or not justification, but the way someone would be convinced by this is the fact that like these money are not actually going to the Palestinians. But increasingly when I'm like hearing the news from this, I'm wondering how much people who support Hamas, who support Palestine, even care about the individual Palestinians. We talked about this a little bit. Uh, so I'm wondering if this story will actually like change anyone's mind
Well,
about.
maybe in this sense, there's a possibility is that the idiotic leftists, for instance, in America, that they claim to be fighting for the plight of the Palestinian. The Palestinian people are being oppressed. They're poor. They're starving. Whatever. But in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, it has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with we don't want Jews in the Middle East. That's what has been causing the problem from the get-go, from the establishment of the Jewish state. It's been about no Jews. It hasn't been about, well, we're poor. There's poor people in other Arab countries, but they're not all upset about that. They're upset about this because of the Jews. Now, the idiotic leftists that I mentioned that are in America, I mean, the people of their ilk ignored what was happening in the Soviet Union, for God's sake. They didn't care about that. They didn't care about the slaughter of civilians and the starving of the kulaks. Nobody, the leftists over here weren't concerned about that. So I just don't see them being all that persuadable by the fact that you have these corrupt billionaires. They might say yes, but then the problem is get rid of those corrupt billionaires. They're not going to determine then that Hamas itself is the issue. The problem is ultimately, Daniel, is that they don't like Israel. They look at Israel as an oppressive force, and that's all. And then if you go to the far right haters of Israel, it's the same thing. They just don't like Israel. They don't like the fact that there's an Israeli state, and that's all it is. So the concern about corruption in Hamas isn't going to persuade them either. Doesn't mean that it shouldn't be pointed out. I mean, if it's the truth, it's the truth, and the truth should, is always worth knowing. But as far as persuasion goes, I just don't see it as a very effective strategy. Could be wrong. I've been wrong before, but I don't think I am this time.
Yeah, you definitely see this like a complete lack of principles. We'll talk about one politician a bit later. But a lot of people, when you mention the people from the right, they hide their hatred of Israel sometimes behind their kind of libertarian foreign policy or non-interventionist foreign policy, like, oh, US shouldn't send money to Ukraine or to Israel because US just shouldn't like send money. But they always like start with Israel and they always start with
Right.
Ukraine and don't mention the other countries. So that's why I'm always wondering if is this really your like somewhat principled position, or do you start with, okay, I don't like Israel, what can I come up with for a reason to not support them?
Well, I'm a non-interventionist.
Mm.
I don't believe that the United States of America should be giving money to Israel. I don't think we should be giving money to Ukraine. I nevertheless recognize that Hamas and Israel are not morally equivalent. One is a civilized government, a civilized country trying to live in peace, and the other are barbarian religionists who want to kill people in the name of their God, who think it's their land and they're willing to murder over it. So, that's a big issue with me with the people who say that they're just non-interventionists, because if you then look further into their comments, you'll often hear them say things such as the Zionist regime or the Zionist occupying force, or they refer to I think it's the IDF, and they point out how, oh, they're killing civilians. So if they're really just opposed to foreign aid, or they're opposed to intervention, then you can oppose that on principle, but still point out that Israel is right in this situation. They have a right to exist and have a right to obliterate Hamas.
Uh, so maybe we can move on to talk about Qatar a little bit. So something that happened last year, Qatar was granted this special status from America, basically designing them as an let me just look up this special status in the top tier of America's non-NATO allies. Some of them of this special status include also Israel, Taiwan, South Korea, Australia, and Japan. And specifically in the Middle East, it's also Kuwait and Bahrain. And one politician, Ogles, or is that the name of the politician or the name of the bill? Oh yeah, it's the name of the politician, Andy Ogles, is sponsoring a bill that would strip Qatar of this special status. And the reason that he gives is that Qatar, one, it keeps these Hamas leaders in its hotels, and is supporting Hamas. So before we talk about Ogles specifically, what do you think about this bill? Do you think Qatar should have this special status as a US ally?
No, I don't. And I don't ultimately know the point of this, except for the resources that they have in the Middle East. So then we end up designating countries over there. What's its special ally? Or I mean, if America's going to war, do we really need Qatar as our special ally to help? I'm guessing no. But for some reason they are, whether it be oil or because we can have bases there, and we think it positions us well. The bottom line is that they're from what I could gather, and I'm no expert on Qatar, but they're a corrupt country like Saudi Arabia. And I think we'll be able to talk about this a little bit more, but the problem ultimately boils down to the mixed nature of the morality of America. And then you end up siding with countries or allying with countries of, very irreparable or immoral. And people say, well, it's for strategic reasons, pragmatic reasons. But when you do that, you end up losing your moral superiority. And it makes it very difficult to make arguments, for instance, like why people should support Israel. And we'll get to that in a minute, and maybe I'll make it a little bit more clear what I mean.
Yeah, and definitely this pragmatic approach of let's just support anyone who fights our enemies is what completely destroys any kind of morality. We just had a video on the Briefly Objective, I think it was with James Valiant, who talked about how we supported the Afghanistan, I think it's Mujahideen against the Soviet Union, just because Soviet Union was atheist. That was, I believe, under Ronald Reagan. Beforehand we supported Soviet Union against the Nazis, and yeah, all these.
This is ultimately, you're making the point for one of the reasons I'm a non-interventionist, is because we get involved in World War I, for instance, to back our allies, Britain and France. Then what ends up happening as a result of World War I, you end up with Hitler. Now we got to fight Hitler. So what do? We end up siding with the Soviet Union. That turns half of Europe into a slave pen for 50 years? Because we did that. And then we end up having to fight proxy wars against the Soviet Union, like you said, in Afghanistan. So we end up back in the Mujahideen, And then they end up turning on us and we have to go to war with them. We also backed Iraq against Iran, and then we end up going to war with Iraq. And a lot of that could just be avoided by not getting ourselves involved with these unsavory people and unsavory countries.
So one thing I also wanted to talk about is while we were talking about this unprincipled and complete personality disorder nature of all US politicians, I tried to look up Andy Ogles. He's a Republican who sponsored this bill to strip Qatar of this special status. Because I think I would maybe support, like I cannot see a good reason why we should ally ourselves, especially with these dictatorial nations. And when you look up his positions, it starts pretty nice. It's like, oh, he's a fiscal conservative, and he's a free marketeer, and he said election in 2020 was stolen, and he hates gays, and he's anti-Roe v. Wade,
Right.
and I think what else? Well, he's anti-abortion and all this. And it's like, well, you can never like get happy about any politician because
No.
everything is so. I mean, even with when you talked about Ukraine, Israel, and who is the real enemy, well, you can either side with the left, who think Ukraine and Palestine or Hamas are the good guys, and then if you want to side with Republicans, well, they believe the Russians and the Israelis are the good guys. So even there, even on something like maybe simpler like this, even there you cannot like pick a politician who you can
Right.
fully support.
Well, first of all, I would bet dollars to peanuts that if you really looked into this guy, you'd find out that he's not much of a free market supporter. That would be my bet. What's called free market supporters and what actually are often very different. But the fact that he, like you said, he's opposed to homosexuality. This is another problem that this situation brings up is
Oh,
that
just if I can quote, after Roe v. Wade was overturned, he said, "We are going after gays next." I
okay,
think something like that was specifically what he said.
okay. Well, the points to religiosity. And a big part of the support for Israel among conservatives in this country is that they're Christians. And they believe that, well, the Holy Land was meant for the Jews. God gave it to them, and therefore we have to defend them. The problem with that line of argument, well, first of all, it's ridiculous and it's not true. There's no God. He's not a real estate agent. But what's the difference? If you're going to get into that argument, if you're going to say, well, God promised the land to the Jews, right? The Muslim comes along and says, no, God gave the land to the Muslims. Well, how the hell are you ever going to resolve that argument? You
And
end up with a
not
bunch of
even that the land was given to Muslims. What I think Prophet Muhammad said it specifically that until there are like Jews around, you like Muslims like cannot exist, or I can't remember it
I,
exactly.
I don't know. I don't know. There's certainly inconsistencies in the Quran about whether to how you're going to relate to other religions. But the whole point I'm getting at is it's fiction. And once you're going to use fiction as the base of your argument, there's no way to win it. The problem is that Israel also is a mixed case. Now, I pointed out earlier the religious barbarity of Hamas, but Israel itself is a mixture of a secular state and a religious state, right? There's plenty of people in Israel that are Jews that believe that the land was promised them by God. And that's just not a way to make an argument because there's no way to win it. You're not dealing with reason any longer. Now, there's the argument that I've heard people of our ilk making is that Israel is basically a enlightenment based country, reason, freedom, individual rights, and to a large extent they are, but they're also very mixed. And that's part of the problem with this entire situation, the entire world, much of our politics is that everybody's mixed. And it makes it very difficult often to say, who should I side with? That's not to say, let me be clear, that it's difficult for me to decide between Israel and Hamas, but that's because of the extreme evil of Hamas makes it clear. But most situations aren't that clear, especially in politics, and it just makes it very difficult to navigate.
Yeah, I think that's why you should never really fall into this tribalism that I've seen even some objectivists fall to, that
Uh-oh.
just because Democrats are bad, automatically we should support Republicans. There are not many on the opposite side that say, Republicans are so bad, we should support Democrats, whatever. But you really have to, I think, decide on a bit more case by case basis. That doesn't mean like not be principled, but like look at if you're talking about specific politicians, look at the actual policy they support, not the party they are behind. Or even when you talk about uh yeah, nations. I mean, yeah, I'm not saying Ukraine or Israel are uh the capitalist dream nations, but you can clearly see that Russia and Hamas or even Palestine are are bad. I mean, how I cannot see why. And I've been listening to a lot of if you know streamer Destiny, maybe.
No.
He's been doing a lot of research on basically when the war started, he was like supportive of Israel a little bit. And then he like started doing a lot of research, and he's like a leftist guy. And the more research he does, the more he is like supportive of Israel. So I've seen a lot of debates of him and some of the leftist guys who support Hamas or Palestine, and a lot of it is like going back 70 years to like justify why it's okay anything Hamas does. Just because the borders look different 70 years ago, Hamas has a justification to just do whatever.
Which in my view they clearly don't, but I don't buy into the whole Israel was an oppressor nation from the start anyway. But back to what you said about, you have objectivists who say support the right, support the right. I would question whether such people are objectivist anyways. But
Mm.
the thing is that when you get into discussions with a lot of people of that viewpoint, they'll say, well, the left is so bad, we have to support the right, which is basically a lesser of two evils argument. And I'm not going to begrudge anybody that votes for Donald Trump because they think he's the lesser of two evils. These are difficult choices to make. I wouldn't personally do it, but I get it. But quickly, what ends up happening is they'll go from saying you have to support the lesser of two evils to defending everything Donald Trump says and does. And so it's not really that they're supporting the lesser of two evils. They actually support Trump. And some people will go so far as to claim like Trump is a exemplar of objectivism, or he could have been an Ayn Rand hero. That's absolutely absurd. But I think it kind of goes back to what we were just talking about of mixed cases. And if you have somebody that's of a mixed philosophy claiming to be an objectivist, well, then they can easily support Donald Trump and say, well, he's an objectivist too.
Just quickly, let me thank Jonathan. Thank you so much for your super chat. Thank you, Bonnie. She's been supporting us every day so far, so for a while now. So thank you so much. And also thank you, Wes. I see a lot of comments in the chat. Just quickly, let me comment on someone commented Destiny is a leftist, but he debated Marxist Richard Wolff. Well, he would like he's like he's a big time capitalist. So he like if you wanted to classify him, he would be like a social democrat. So like someone who still supports capitalism, but like believes there is like a role for the state in it. So just to comment on that. So we are running out of time. Anything else you'd like to say, Michael, about this whole topic? We talked about many
Just that
things.
Hamas is an evil organization, whether their leaders are raking in billions or not. And I guess they are. So they're probably doubly evil because they're not only wanting to kill Jews, but they're also ripping off their own people. So I'd say that's, a very horrible thing. And I think that all in all, we should lend our moral support to Israel. Whether it goes beyond that, I think that should be up to each individual to decide. But it's ultimately everything's up to each individual. But I think it should be unequivocal that we morally back Israel in their fight for survival against religious barbarians.
Yeah, and Israel definitely needs all the moral support. Uh, it can get, especially since they don't have the moral confidence to actually crush Hamas. I mean, like I said, we had it in the news. They just announced that they would have a humanitarian pause for 4 hours every day. Let me quickly thank Enric for your super chat, and I'm putting in the chat. We have a reality show coming up in about 5 minutes. I believe Michael's gonna be on.
I will be, but maybe you
Uh,
shouldn't have said that. They might tune out now that
no,
they know.
I'm after this conversation, I believe everyone will go there. So thank you, Michael, for today, and
Thank
we'll
you.
see everyone in a couple of minutes. Bye bye.
Beautiful.